Hi everyone. I'm so delighted to be here. This is my very first visit to Oklahoma. Besides the time I was transported there on the stage of my high school auditorium when I was in the Oklahoma production at Bentworth High School. But what a beautiful city. Very excited to be here. Very excited to tell Tree Pittsburgh's story, Pittsburgh's story. Well, it's not going to be my focus today, talking about just how lovable Pittsburgh is. I have to piggyback on what Peter was saying because trees really are a part of what makes Pittsburgh so lovable. This is a great, actually, let me go back here. This is a great shot of Pittsburgh. You know, we're a very hilly city, and there are many view sheds where you can go and enjoy the green ribbon that wraps around the city. So here's a lovely picture of an oak tree atop of a hillside. We've been getting a really amazing national press, and we're growing a green reputation. I'm sure when you think of Pittsburgh, you think of of us as a Rust Belt city, our steel heritage, industrial heritage, but it was key leaders in our city's history. Primarily, we had a mayor back in the 90s when all of the steel mills, they had closed. We were left with all of these vacant brownfields right on the riverfronts. What are we going to do with them? And he really stood up and said, we need to make sure these riverfronts are accessible to the public. And there's this great story of him having a screaming match with Art Rooney, the owner of the Steelers, who wanted to build a facility on the river and keep that riverfront private. And he held their occupancy permit until they agreed to keep an easement on the riverfront there. Now you can get on your bike in Pittsburgh and ride your bike all the way to Washington, D.C. And it was, again, you know, the leadership. Now, you know, we have these trails, people come to town, you could rent a bike, there's cafes along the rivers, there's a whole industry that popped up around it. There's outdoor recreational organizations, there's just an explosion of environmental preservation and restoration activity happening in Pittsburgh, and Tree Pittsburgh is a big part of that. So while I'm sure you know what this means, I just wanted to make sure we're all talking about the same thing when we think about the urban forest. It's not just our public trees. I always say the tree that's growing out of a crack in an alleyway is part of the urban forest. The tree in your backyard, the tree in the public park, or along the roadways. Urban forestry, again, it's kind of a newer area of study. A lot of the universities that have forestry programs, they don't have specific urban forestry degrees. They're very limited. So a lot of the learning that happens in urban forestry happens between organizations like Up With Trees, Tree Pittsburgh, Trees NYC. We're really big into sharing and coming together, bringing our knowledge to the table. So Tree Pittsburgh. Tree Pittsburgh was started by the city of Pittsburgh. We have a shade tree commission, and back in 2005, they put together the city's very first street tree inventory and management plan. And what they found is there was about an $8 million backlog of maintenance on city street trees. That's a lot of money. So the Shade Tree Commission went to some local foundations and asked for assistance. And it was at the bequest of the foundations that Tree Pittsburgh was started. Those foundations, and I'm happy to report, said you need an organization that deals with this issue more holistically, that engages the public in the planting and care of trees. So back in 2006, the organization was formed, and we opened up an office early 2007. Our mission, just like Up With Trees, is to protect and restore our city's tree population, and we do that through tree planting, tree care, education, and advocacy. So why embark on this plan? At that point in time, we were around 2010. We had been up and running for a few years. There was a really large tree planting campaign that came down from the state. Our goal was to plant 20,000 trees, but that was a completely arbitrary number. The secretary of our DCNR at the time told Philadelphia, I want you to plant 20,000 trees. So then a couple years later, he went to Pittsburgh and said, why don't you plant 20,000 trees? But there was no rhyme or reason behind that number. We had the success of the street tree inventory and the management plan, and were able to gain a lot of momentum. We spearheaded a volunteer program called Tree Tenders. We now have 1,400 tree tenders, and these are folks who study with us for 8 hours and continue to volunteer in their communities. And then we had models to look at. New York City was really setting the stage for what many cities are doing now with their Million Trees campaign. And it wasn't just a million, they actually had science behind that number. They knew how many trees they needed, they knew where they could go, and they knew who would plant which trees where. And moreover, as a nonprofit manager, I needed some direction where to take the organization. So it really made sense. I always say, you know, there's just these common sense reasons why you need a plan. We know we want to maximize the benefits of trees. We want to achieve sustainability. We want to minimize safety risks, improve quality of life. All of these great reasons why we needed this plan. We knew who our partners needed to be. We knew that the utilities were going to be involved, the municipal government, not just local, but county and state. We knew there were some key institutions, some major property owners, whether they were hospitals or universities, that needed to be a part of this, cemeteries, and of course our many nonprofit partners, and residents, of course, residents. So as you heard in the introduction, we started with a symposium just like this. I knew from the beginning that if I wanted somebody to buy into this plan later on, they needed to be part of the planning process itself. So we put together a symposium. About 50 people showed up, a profile very similar to what you have here today, and we created a framework for the plan. So I put this together just for today because I always get this question, well, how much did your planning process cost you? Your planning process does not need to cost this much. We invested about $250,000 over the life of this 2-year project. You can see here a breakdown. It was not cheap. But the beauty of this is I'm willing to give everything that we've done that could save Tulsa money, just hand it right over to Steve and his team, so you're not starting from scratch. Our project team, we had local facilitators, just like you have here today. We worked with the University of Vermont, who is really a leader in urban tree canopy analysis, as well as Davie Resource Group, who also is a leader in urban forestry planning, and they were the firm that worked on our street tree inventory with us. So this was our team, along with Tree Pittsburgh. And this is the model that we used for our plan, and I'm going to come back to this again later. But it's a really common model for planning, and it's just answering the questions, what do we have, what do we want, how do we get there, and how are we doing? So what do we have? Does anybody want to guess what the city's tree canopy might be in Pittsburgh? Steve, you said yours is 20-something?
35.
What was that? 35? We're actually at 42%, which is one of the highest tree canopies in the nation. But while that might sound impressive, some maps that I'm going to show you later show that not everybody benefits equally from that tree canopy, and that our geography has a lot to do with that green as well. So what we did, we put together existing data and reports. If Tulsa is anything like Pittsburgh, we love planning, and every neighborhood has a plan, every institution has a plan. So we wanted to make sure that we were respecting all of that work that had already been done. So we pulled together a lot of that information, which I definitely would recommend that you do here as well. We benchmarked 6 other cities, and we didn't shoot for the San Franciscos, the Portlands. We threw in Seattle because they're always a green city that we look to. But we also looked at Buffalo. We looked at Baltimore. We looked at Washington, D.C. We wanted to make sure that the cities we were choosing had similar challenges, similar budgets, populations. And again, that's something that I would certainly make available to you. We did the tree canopy analysis, and we did the public outreach campaign. So here's our 42% tree canopy by neighborhood. You see our 3 rivers there. The lighter the color, the less canopy. It's not surprising that our river valleys have less tree canopy, and I'm sure you could take a guess at why that is. Anybody? That's where industry was. That's where the steel mills were, the factories, the barges, loading up. So really all of the neighborhoods along our rivers, we have one neighborhood along the river that has 5% tree canopy compared to the 42% average. So you can see how valuable this map is for us. The darker neighborhoods, that's where some of our major parks are. There's, for example, a 600-acre park in this neighborhood here, which really skews the data. another large park here, another large park here. And then all along above the rivers, you have a ridge on this side. And that ridge, we actually passed some zoning requirements that make them undevelopable. So they have to stay green if they're at a certain slope. So that really helps to preserve a lot of the tree canopy. But again, the canopy isn't necessarily where people live. And if we were to put socioeconomic data over top of this, or crime data, we found some really compelling information. We were seeing high poverty, low tree canopy, high renter versus home ownership, low tree canopy, high crime, low tree canopy. While we're not doing formal research around this, it's really hard to deny some of the relationships that you see. Now the map on the right shows you possible tree canopy. So you could see as a tree planting organization how this information can really help us to target where we plant trees, where we do our outreach. So there's the bird's eye view of the city, and that's the 42%, but you also need to understand the condition of your trees, the age, distribution of your trees, your species breakdown. That's very valuable information. And when we talked to the other cities during the benchmark report phase, all of them said that. They said, you can't just go off of your tree canopy analysis. You also have to get that ground, I call it the groundhog's eye view. You have the bird, and you have the groundhog. So we worked with Davie Resource Group, who followed a protocol that was developed by the U.S. Forest Service. It's called iTree Eco, and it's random sampling around the city. And we took over, I think it was about 800 samples from across the city. It's a lot of sampling. But we hired 2 college kids local, and then Davie sent in a couple folks to mentor them. So it took about 3 months to do this sampling, but it gave us really valuable information about the types of trees that we had, what condition they were in, how old they were. So this is another graph here that shows you land use, also very important. Because a lot of times in our line of work, when we're talking about planting trees, we always say, oh, we need government buy-in, we need government buy-in. You do, but guess what? What we've discovered, it's private citizens that own most of the urban forest. It's private citizens who own most of the land where there's possible canopy growth. So we knew that we really needed to focus in on residential properties in some way. Again, understanding the condition, why it's so important, we're faced with a lot of pests and diseases right now. Pittsburgh was hit really hard by the emerald ash borer. I'm sure you've heard of that insect. We have gypsy moth. God save us all if the Asian longhorn beetle comes to Pittsburgh. This is this guy here. I always say that's nearly life size. It's a large insect and you can't miss it. But the northeast in New England, Massachusetts was hit really hard with this. They love maple trees. And you can imagine how catastrophic this would be to New England if they were to lose maple trees during the fall season. I mean, that's a major economic driver for them. So here in Pittsburgh, this is how many trees we stand to lose if Asian longhorn beetle comes to town. And it was found in Cincinnati, so it's not that far from us. It wasn't so bad with the emerald ash borer compared to cities in Michigan that were completely wiped out, but the ash tree is a pioneer species. It grows readily on our hillside. So the ash trees that we do have are mostly smaller ash trees. And the ash trees along our street, because we had an inventory, we knew we had about 330. That's not a lot. So we knew exactly how much it would cost, and we had a project where we could remove those ash and replant them. Dutch elm disease here and gypsy moth. So the value, Peter talked about not understanding the value, and that's definitely true. And this iTree program was developed by the U.S. Forest Service and a consortium of other experts to communicate the value of trees in a way that municipal officials, business leaders might understand. I always warn against putting a monetary value on everything because, again, there's that emotional connection that you really can't put a dollar price tag on. But these trees do save energy. They do clean the air. They do improve public health. They clean our water. You know, there's so many benefits that trees provide. And in old cities like Pittsburgh, we still have one of the worst air qualities in the nation. We have really horrible particulate matter that comes out of the coal burning power plants. It's a major, major issue in Pittsburgh. We have major stormwater problems. Every time it rains in Pittsburgh, sewage flows into the river, every time. So we are under a decree from the EPA to clean up our act. So again, I need to be able to advocate for trees, and this has been a really powerful program for us. And as trees mature, does the value go up or down? Goes up. Bigger trees give more benefits. So while we might be getting, this is just the street trees here on the right, we get about $2.5 million of benefits annually from our street trees. As they grow larger, those benefits increase. So moving on to what do we want? Pittsburgh is a very civically engaged city. Our residents are very involved. If you have a community meeting, people show up. It's a beautiful thing about the city. So we definitely knew we needed the public input. We also knew we needed a steering committee. We had surveys. We put the plan online so that people could review and comment. We sent them to key people. We even sent them outside of Pittsburgh so that the plan could be peer reviewed as well. Working with Davey, the very first meeting we had, we said, listen, we don't want this to be just some typical plan that never leaves the shelf. We really want this to set the standard for what urban forest master plans will look like. And I think we've really achieved that. So this was our steering committee. I'm not going to read through it, but as you can see, we really tried to make sure we got the utilities, the institutions, the key policymakers, experts, the different authorities. We wanted to get them involved in the creation of this plan. So with the outreach campaign, we spent a little money on this, and we created an ad campaign with materials. You can see here, every tree has a story. We actually took our camera and went around to different museums, public festivals, and we collected people's tree stories. Again, getting to that emotional connection of trees. Once we got folks to start talking about a story about a tree, they started talking more broadly. What they like about trees, where they would like to see more trees, what kind of trees they like. And this information all went back to our planning team and made it into the plan. We created a vision statement for our plan, again, coordinating all of the stakeholders around a single vision. We have a mayor right now who was elected just a couple years ago, very progressive, very green, travels all over the world bringing ideas back to the city. So all of a sudden, I woke up one morning and there's a bike lane installed downtown. You know, he's making these huge changes overnight. So I knew, again, even with the past mayor, all of these ideas, we needed to make sure, all right, you're installing a bike lane, but let's talk about planting trees along that bike lane. So we knew we needed this coordinated vision. So the goals of the plan, we have connect, engage, manage, plan, and protect. And those are the themes of the plan. Let me show you what it looks like. I brought a couple copies, and we always joke that we purposely made it this size so that it doesn't fit on any shelf. You can't just stick it there and never see it again. It has to sit out flat, and you're constantly reminded. So that was definitely done on purpose. So jumping into the plan. So connect. And what I'm going to do, I'm not going to read through every single recommendation, every single goal. I'm going to give you a little snapshot. There's a lot in the plan, but it's broad stroke. There's definitely some specificity in the appendix. You have to read the appendix. For example, we have whole species lists back there, you know, different target percentages of different species that we want to plant. We do get into the nitty gritty, but what I'm going to be sharing with you here is broad. So connect. Again, connecting urban forest partners through that single vision, utilizing research. Something as simple as, you know, in our downtown, we've invested, oh my goodness, nearly $1 million in tree planting. But what we're discovering is if we plant trees in the fall, they're not surviving. They are the ones that are dying. So something as simple as that, saying, all right, we're going to change the way we do things based on just our observations, but also bringing in the broader research as well. Increasing access to trees so that all can enjoy. Big issue in Pittsburgh. It's so clear that the wealthier, well-to-do neighborhoods are the ones with the trees. The poorer neighborhoods are the folks that don't have the trees. So how do we address that? So again, now here it goes into a recommendation, giving priority for urban forestry and outreach activities to disadvantaged communities that are currently gaining the least benefits from trees. And when I talk about how we're implementing this, I'll talk about a specific project that gets to that recommendation. So engage. Pittsburgh, I don't know if Tulsa is this way, but we are a city of neighborhoods. People wear t-shirts with their neighborhood name. You know, when all the different immigrant groups came to Pittsburgh, they kind of settled in clusters. So you have this really cool little, and we're also hilly, so you have these, like a Polish neighborhood, a Russian neighborhood, Italian neighborhoods. And that is it's one of the very special things about Pittsburgh. So we knew that getting down to the neighborhood level was going to be very important. Implementing a comprehensive outreach and education campaign, encouraging public and private participation in urban forest management through volunteerism, getting our corporations involved, getting our universities involved. This recommendation I love, and I purposely picked it out because I think it's really important. When you think about the benefits that trees provide, use that as your planning component. So for example, we have a neighborhood that we're working in during the surveying process. We knew this already, but then it came out in the survey. When we asked that particular neighborhood, what is the biggest environmental challenge in your neighborhood? Air quality and heat were the top two. And this is one of those neighborhoods that sit right on the river. You have a power plant upriver, and there's a fabrication plant right on the river there. So the air's bad right there, and it's really hot. We have some really good heat maps, which I also recommend you use, that shows the hot spots of the city. Tulsa might just be one big glowing red orb, but you'll see with the tree canopy the difference that it makes. And in this particular neighborhood, it was on a 90-degree day in Pittsburgh, it was 95 degrees in this neighborhood. So we knew those were the two major issues. So when you talk about trees and you're planning around trees, use those benefits. So when you think about where you're planting them, you're going to plant shade trees next to houses. You're going to plant buffers around the plants. Thinking about evergreen trees to help during all 4 seasons to help with the air pollution capture. So really thinking in terms of benefits versus just a tree for tree's sake. Manage. Again, this was a section of the plan we were going to have to rely heavily on our municipal partners for. We knew that our trees lacked regular routine maintenance, our public trees. The current forestry division is a skeleton of its former self. Whenever the mills closed down in the 70s and 80s, the city budgets were cut in half, more than half. And we have I think we have about 8 guys today in our forestry division that have to care for, 38,000 street trees and all of our parks, and it's a lot of work. So really focusing in on building capacity within the forestry division, that's what a big part of this section of the plan is all about. And right now, we were able to raise funds to redo our street tree inventory and do an operations review for the forestry division that looks at what equipment do you have, what skill set do you have in your division, how many workers do you have, how do they work, what kind of trucks do they have, really looking at the whole division and making suggestions for improvement so that they can work better. And Davie Resource Group, again, is a partner in that operations review. So plan, again, looking at what we focused on here is that land use type. How can we use the tree canopy data that we have and go all the way down to, you could pick a university. You could hone in on a university and say, university, you have 20% tree canopy, you have a possible 30%. how do we get you from 20 to 30? And work exclusively with that institution on increasing their tree canopy. So this data, there's a gajillion ways to slice and dice it, but you can make it very, very personal. You could do that with cemeteries, schools, municipal parks, anything. Protect, of course, this is a major issue again in Pittsburgh with all the pests and diseases. As our city gets hotter, the pests and diseases are getting worse. So really focusing on doing education, not just with the public, hey, what does ALB look like? But also municipal workers, the guys and gals that are out there every day caring for parks, whether they're just cutting grass or emptying trash cans. Now these guys know how to identify an Asian longhorn beetle or an emerald ash borer, so very important. And then of course we need to measure how we're doing. You know, around the graph here you could see, well, when do we want to measure? You know, there's some basic recommendations about every 5 to 10 years. But what if a big storm, what if a tornado comes through or a flood comes through? There's also these catastrophic events that might happen where you're going to have to stop, regroup, and change your plan up. We had a comprehensive land use plan done for the city. It's still in process. So as that evolves, we have to make sure the plan keeps up with that. The Pittsburgh Urban Forest Review, this was published last year, and that was our first formal review of how we're doing. And we made it kind of like a magazine as opposed to just a boring charts and graphs, here's how we're doing. We wanted the public to read it as well, so we tried to make it a little more interesting, and it is available on our website. We're in the middle of launching the second one. Also, we made a big deal out of this plan. You know, when we were finished, ready to launch it, the guy you see here, that's Butch Blazer. He is a high up with the U.S. Forest Service, and he came to Pittsburgh. All the Forest Service folks came out in their uniforms, which is always exciting to see. And we got the mayor, and we rented a bus, and we took everybody all around the city on a green tour. We had a press conference, and the media really picked up on this. This is, as I said, Butch here, our mayor spoke. And we had a party, again, making it fun. We had cocktails and food at a great venue, and we invited everybody who was involved in the making of the plan and anybody who might be a stakeholder in the plan. So how are we implementing? We had the steering committee, and once the plan was finished, we had the steering committee prioritize the parts of the plan. And once we did that, we created working groups. So again, back to that connect, engage, plan, protect, manage, those were the themes that we stuck with, and that's how we formed the working groups. So we had this connect and engage, that's a list of some of the partners. Then that's when we really got into the specifics. And with this group in particular, we held a day-long workshop for community development corporations and community organizations. We had an inspiring speaker, and then we taught them all about trees, how to manage a tree planting contract. We questioned them first, you know, what do you need to know more about? Because a lot of these folks are managing business district improvement contracts, they're leading volunteer activities, so how can we give them all of the information that they need? We also targeted landscape architects, because what we're finding, you might have a landscape architect who is really great at making things beautiful, but maybe they don't know an awful lot about tree species themselves and how they're gonna do long term, or they might not know how their small project could fit into the really larger urban forestry plan for the city. So we did a lot of outreach to landscape architects. They all need continuing ed credits, so we worked with the local Penn State Extension who offers those credits, and we delivered workshops to them. So just an example. Homeowners as well, doing pruning workshops for homeowners. Manage, I had already mentioned that we raised money to redo the street tree inventory, and we did the operations review. But we're also trying to come up with a larger tree maintenance system for the whole city. You have a couple nonprofits, including ourselves, you have the city, you have the Parks Conservancy. Everybody's caring for a little bit of green in the city, but nothing's really coordinated. There are no formal agreements between the city and the NGOs. So we're really working on making that more of a system that lasts for years to come. Plan. So this is my particular favorite part, and I'm going to hold off on this for a second to show you the project that we're working on. Protect. Again, this is a group of tree experts who do scouting expeditions together. They do education for municipal workers, for the public. Tree Pittsburgh leads this working group, and it's a lot about just preparing for the pests and diseases that are not only there but are coming. So this is a really cool plan that I'm excited to share. So one of those recommendations, as I mentioned, was taking the planning model down to the neighborhood level. This is the neighborhood that I was telling you about with the air quality and the heat issues. There's also a major business corridor that's really up and coming, lots of boutiques, shops, but there's also a lot of truck traffic along the road. So another issue there with the air quality. So what we did, and we also have a lot of volunteers in this neighborhood. It's very active. We have a lot of what we call tree tenders there. It is, oh, next slide. Let's see. This is the map of the city again. So here are the neighborhoods that I'm referring to, these three. It's the lower, middle, and upper Lawrenceville, but together they comprise Lawrenceville. You have a riverfront trail. You have a light industrial zone, you have a business district, you have a residential area, you have schools, you have a historic cemetery, you have a little of everything. So we thought it was a really good starting point to try this neighborhood level planning. You also have a lot of creative people in the neighborhood, a lot of designers. There's a lot of architect and landscape architect firms, graphic designers. So we got them involved as well, but they came up with this logo. Relief is not an original name. It's used broadly across the country, but we're calling these plans Relief wherever. In this case, we're in Lawrenceville. So our first neighborhood, just like the big plan, we developed a State of the Urban Forest report for the neighborhood. There were already some neighborhood level plans developed, some park plans. There are a couple small parklets. So we pulled all of that existing stuff together. We looked at the heat information, the canopy information, the street tree information, and we were able to produce a report and deliver it to the public and use that data in the plan. We had the public outreach campaign. We had over 1,200 respondents to this survey, which really blew our mind. And again, it took a couple residents that we brought on as neighborhood ambassadors. We paid them a very small stipend of $300 a month, just as a gesture, because we knew they would be giving us more time, and that was for a year. So they really helped us with this survey. And we got neighborhood businesses to give coupons. So if you filled out the survey, you got this master sheet of coupons for all the businesses. We got a really great response. But we asked them, do you want a tree in your yard? Because of course we're going to use that information later. We could contact those 68 people or whatever it was and say, hey, you said you wanted a tree. We're going to start a backyard tree planting program. Would you like to be our first recipients? We asked what kind of trees they like, where they needed more trees. Lots of great questions that helped us inform the plan. Again, here's that map that you saw earlier, honed in right down to the parcel level. That's amazing that you could look at it. Big Brother doing a little good here with trees. We can really see at a very small scale where we should be targeting our tree planting efforts. And of course, reporting our progress. Just like with the big plan, we're going to have some annual reports. A couple projects that came out of Relief Lawrenceville, we call it My Tree. So again, knowing that we needed to get in with the residents in their really small yards in this neighborhood, but we did have a very successful first-time backyard tree planting initiative. We asked for $10 just as a subsidy, so we knew they would show up the day that they needed to pick up their tree. And we had about 70 people participate in that program, which was pretty great to get 70 trees in the ground in one weekend. We're also targeting light industrial areas of the neighborhood, working with our health department, our county health department. They recently awarded us a pilot grant to target industrial areas to create these buffer zones between the neighborhood and the industry and try to get a match out of the corporation so that it's not just 100% we're paying for everything. We're working on trying to get a 50-50 match. So we'll be doing that in this neighborhood. They're targeting some specific streets for planting. I mentioned there is a riverfront trail in this neighborhood, so creating green street corridors where people walk to go down to the neighborhood. So you could see, you could really get personal, you could really get specific when you're working at the neighborhood scale. So I wanted to point this out because one of the key recommendations in the plan is to increase our tree canopy by 20% over 20 years. So 42%, we want to try to get to at least 60. But what does that mean? And you know, there's still argument around this among urban forestry professionals, how you turn a percentage into a number of trees, right? So stick with me. I created this crazy formula and I took it to the Forest Service and I said, am I crazy? Does this make sense? And they looked at it and they said, yeah, that works. Let's go with it. So stick with me, as I said. So we know we have 42% tree canopy. If you transfer that into acres, we have 14,883 acres of trees out of a total 35,400 acres of land. So to increase the tree canopy by 20%, that's an additional 7,080 additional acres of trees. So assuming 100 trees equals 1 acre of canopy, that's 708,000 trees. That's a lot of trees, right? But in Pittsburgh, we have a lot of vacant land, we have a lot of hillsides. A lot of trees are just naturally regrowing. You see this in cities like Detroit, who are actually experiencing an increase of tree canopy without doing much of anything. So annually, let's say that's 354 acres, assuming half of that is natural regeneration, then we're looking at 17,700 trees to be planted annually. And that's the little guys, that's the big guys, that's everything all together. That's still a lot of trees. That would cost a lot of money. So you could break it down even more. You could think about, well, some of those could be street trees, some of those could be cemetery trees, some could be riparian areas. Then you could create a budget. So you see where I'm going with this? There's a way to take these big ideas and really turn them into working plans and putting budgets around them so you know how much money you need to raise. Are we going to achieve that? Am I going to plant 17,000 trees this year? No. I'm probably going to plant about 5,000 trees this year. But again, that goes back to getting the institutions, the developers. There's a lot of development happening in Pittsburgh. How can we get them to start planting trees too so that everybody's trees are counted into the pie? Again, getting back to what makes your city lovable, and I always share this quote, I think it's so great, Theodore Roosevelt, to exist as a nation, to prosper as a state, to live as people, we must have trees. And at this point, I'll open it up for questions.
Any questions for Danielle?
In 2008, Tulsa had a devastating ice storm that there's probably not a single tree in our urban forest that wasn't adversely affected by that. And so my question for you is, does Pittsburgh have ice storms? And the second part of the question is, our utility companies, in order to protect our citizens from loss of power during these things, goes through periodically and cuts trees, prunes them, that's a generous way to describe it, butchers them in most cases. So do you have a strategy or solutions for dealing with ice storms and particularly the damage? If the damaged areas are not removed quickly and in a timely fashion, the trees are at much greater risk and have a poor chance for survival over a period of time. We're still losing trees today from what happened in 2008.
Do you, did Tulsa declare a state of emergency at that point?
I believe if we did, we had the state actually was declared, but for months, it took like 6 months for us to recover and just clean up the debris. There were these areas where they were collecting the trees and then they were...
Oh, I remember. And you think of what New York City just went through with flooding, and so I have an answer. So if you have a street tree inventory or a park tree inventory, you could access FEMA dollars if you're accessing FEMA for cleanup. there is a way to do that, but you have to have that inventory. And Buffalo has a great story. You know, they experience ice storms like that, and they'll tell you they've been through it, accessing the government dollars to help with cleanup. But a lot of it, and this relates in Pittsburgh, we don't have the extreme weather that you have, but we have our share of floods and microbursts and all of that. The inventory is important, but back to the utility, this all connects. It's choosing the right species and planting them in the right locations. I should be saying, yes, let's plant more street trees, but honestly, it's so expensive, and I'm a big fan of street trees, but it has to be done the right way. You have to choose the right species that will not conflict with utilities, and you have to give it the growing conditions that it needs to thrive and not cause conflicts down the line. That means bigger tree pits, that means diversifying your tree population. We know the trees that don't do well in ice storms or snowstorms, or, you know, we're again, that research, talking to other urban forestry professionals, what's working for you. So that's really key. And the utilities, you know, we work closely with, they're called Duquesne Light, it's our electric utility, but there's gas that's cutting up the roots of the trees. So one thing that we did in our city is we came up with a species list, and the utilities were actually at the table. They're vegetation management folks. And we have a utility compatible list that they sign off on. There's some trees that were planted so long ago, you still got to deal with that issue. And unfortunately, it's until that tree's gone, they have to clear the way for power, right? There's no way around it. But it's really doing it differently moving forward. That's the only thing we could do at this point. And then getting that inventory of your trees so that you can access the money.
Yeah, Danielle, I actually have a question about inventory, because I think that's the stage that Tulsa's going to enter next.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were to drive around Tulsa, one of the things that if you knew your trees might stand out as being unusual is the prevalence of southern magnolias here. This is not an area that you would ever think normally would grow southern magnolias so well. So just using that as an example, because I would think that would be something that would be important to stress in an inventory year that, wow, this is done well. How did y'all use data like that when you're going around Pittsburgh and being like, wow, dawn redwoods do really good here, or whatever tree it may be? Because you really want to capture that, because when you get to your list standpoint, what I see looking at urban forestry programs is the lists tend to be really small. And that's what leads us to the DED problems of the past, or Tulsa's going to have a really bad emerald ash borer problem because we have urbanite ashes all over the place. So looking at diversity, and how did you do that to mitigate future problems?
Yeah. So when we did the first inventory, we found that, I think it was, well, 10% is the threshold. They always say you shouldn't go over 10% of any one species. Well, we were well over 10% on pears, on lindens, on maples, and we had Norway maples, which are a really invasive species. They break apart. So we're basically not planting any of those anymore. They are off the list. They're not even an option. We're planting some maple species, but really it completely informed our planting list down to the point where they are not allowed. I think there must have been a sale on pears in the 90s because every business district in Pittsburgh is lined with them. So it definitely informed our species list. We now are thinking about planting more evergreens, which aren't the best street tree, but if you're thinking about little landscape clusters and the restoration work that you do in the park areas, now anytime we do a planting, 20% of that planting has to be evergreens when possible. So it definitely has informed the list, and it gives us something to go to the nurseries with. We actually started growing our own trees too. But we can go to the nurseries and give them a heads up. These are the trees that we want for the future. And experiment with species.
How do you feel about flowering trees in an area that I have that is there's blight in the area? There was talk about doing like crepe myrtles where they can maybe have a festival or something. And that would probably be more than 20%. In that area.
Well, for those niche plantings, why not, right? If it's something special, like we have a group, the Japanese American Society, they do a Sakura project. So they're planting these clusters of cherry trees and they have festivals and, you know, it brings people together. So I think anybody would say in that instance, it's okay. If it's more of a aesthetic, you know, celebratory installation of trees. But I think you really want to just look at big picture. But I think we've learned some hard lessons too, especially when you think of some of the Midwest cities that planted all elm trees. Every tree, every street lined with elms, and they completely disappeared. And they replanted with ash. So then they lost all of their ash. So within reason, I guess.
Remind us again how big Pittsburgh is as far as land size, square miles, population,
Yeah,
and how many urban foresters you have as well that are on city.
So I think I had the statistic here, 35,000 acres is the city. I don't know what that is in miles. But we're through about 330,000 is our population in the city. But then we hit over 1 million when you go to the metro area of the county.
And then how many urban foresters do you have on staff?
One. We have one city forester. I have 3 certified arborists on staff. We have more than the city has. Up until recently, there was no certified arborist on city staff. So yeah, that's something we really push for.
We have some other folks I'll get to in a second. I want to ask a question. So this afternoon, we're going to be doing a lot of brainstorming and identifying some overall areas of focus. I assume you know a little bit about Tulsa. If you were to compare differences or similarities between Pittsburgh and Tulsa, I'd be interested to hear where you would land there. And if there's any kind of pieces of wisdom or things you'd like to throw out to the group for us to keep in mind as we do our work this afternoon.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure I do know enough. I know that you have an amazing nonprofit partner here that I hope you all embrace, and it seems like they're ready. They have everything they need to take the leadership role on this. So to me, that's when I think about Pittsburgh and Tulsa, the comparison, that's definitely something I see in common. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, I was wondering what the study revealed about specifically food-producing trees in the urban canopy and how you're using that to increase it, and especially in blighted areas.
Yeah, I call it the gateway tree. Fruit trees are the gateway tree. What we learned, not so much from the canopy analysis, but from the surveys that we did, people are very interested in fruit trees. They're interested in having their own fruit tree. So subsequently, we started a fruit tree program, mostly focused on education. We couple with our local urban ag organization called Grow Pittsburgh. And we've had some fruit tree sales. We do how to care for them, how to plant them. We facilitated a couple orchards. There's a lot of money out there right now through the USDA to get some orchards off the ground. So definitely that has been a big result of this. And what we are finding, people are more interested in an apple tree than an oak tree. But how can we, through that apple tree, get them a little more interested in that oak tree?
Yeah, I had a question also. In your master plan, how did you work with at-risk communities in Pittsburgh?
So, how do I answer that? So that's a big question, and that's something I'd be happy to talk to you a lot more about. But I've been doing this now for 15 years, and one thing that I have learned through my career in community organizing is you have to go where people are and you have to make it relevant. So when we talk about the benefits of those trees, so in some of these neighborhoods, their number one priority is safety and getting food on the table. So for example, here's a really practical thing we've done. When we will go and we'll do a tree tender course in the neighborhood, so you don't have to worry about how you're getting there, you could walk. We make sure it's on the bus line, we offer childcare, and we feed you. So little things like that, we make sure that everything we're doing is accessible as possible. So for, let's say, that single mom, she has a way to attend this class without worrying about where her kids are going to be. again, going to the neighborhood, but we always want to be asked too. We don't want to just tramps in and say, hey, we're here to save you, because we're not going to get the best response. But all of that state of the urban forest data that I showed you, when folks from those neighborhoods see that they're at 5% and the city is at 42, some neighborhoods are 70, that upsets them. And they start asking, well, why is that? And how can we change it? And knowing who to go to. And you know how it is in neighborhoods. It's the same person that does everything. So really thinking about how to get into the schools and get the kids involved, but then tapping into those neighborhood leaders as well who know everybody. And then churches were another big way. Some years ago when we did some surveying, we asked people, where do you go for information? Who do you trust? A lot of them said their churches. So how do we get in that Sunday bulletin? How do we, whatever volunteer group the church has, youth group, how do we get involved that way too?
I'd like to know what your funding resources are and what percentage each of those funding resources represents.
Well, it changes from year to year, but let's talk in the context of this plan. The Forest Service was a big funder of this plan, a local foundation called R.K. Mellon Foundation, and the city. So I mentioned there's a shade tree commission. Do y'all have a shade tree commission? It's quasi-governmental, it's legislated. They're very common in cities. I highly recommend it. This body, this entity, they oversee tree policy. They're partly comprised of city employees, but there's also community folks involved. There's a utility person on it. So all the money from bus shelter advertising, it's about $100,000 a year, goes into a trust fund, the Shade Tree Commission Trust Fund. And then the Shade Tree Commission, they might buy a chipper for the forester, they might support our Asian longhorn beetle education, they do all kinds of stuff with the money. So some government, lots of private foundations. I'm learning about Tulsa, that's another thing that's similar. There's a philanthropic community here. Not a lot of cities can say that. Between your corporate and your private family foundations, unfortunately, you're really going to have to lean on those folks to support this until you get everything ready, build your momentum, and you could really start getting the public support, those $100 checks that come from the public on an annual basis. So most of it is really philanthropic at this point.
I work for a school district, and as we build buildings and we hire our landscape architects, they tend to love to do a row of redbud, a sea of pines. They don't do a diversity of species. Do you work with your landscape architects to say, and then as an educational institution, you want a variety of trees so children can actually study different kinds of trees. So do you work with the architects?
And make the landscape fun, right? Peter was saying, make it fun, make it interesting. How can you get four-season interest out of your landscape, having those pines? Let the kids play in the trees, imagine that. Yeah, there was an initiative in Pittsburgh to do, that's a really great grant proposal if somebody wants to fund that, working with the school district to do every school, look at the landscape and come up with a design for trees and some hardscape that makes the landscape more interactive, sustainable. I know the maintenance crews, get them involved in the project because they don't always like trees, which unfortunately. So yeah, that's a great way. Again, land use type. Focusing in on public schools is a way to do that.
I know that trees are your focus, but there's also things like rain gardens for stormwater, and trees are a big part of that. Do you guys expand to encompass places where trees can say interact with gardens?
Absolutely. So we work with our partners. There's different watershed groups that are doing a lot of the rain gardens and the bioswales. There's the urban ag group that's doing the community gardens. So we work with all of them to bring that tree voice to the table. So we do the whole gamut.
I think it would be overflow because now we have to incorporate those.
Yeah, and just recently our Stormwater Authority put out a call for green infrastructure projects. They're giving mini grants and some larger grants too.
Danielle, tell me, you mentioned earlier about crime, but you could see a difference in neighborhoods that had a higher tree canopy had less crime, and there could be many reasons or factors for that, I suppose. But is that a stat you guys are going to continue to measure, and are you going to track that?
So
As
there's
the
a
tree
national-
canopy increases
Yeah.
in these maybe at-risk neighborhoods?
So that would be a dream, to be able to partner with a university to do something like that. There is some national research that focuses on that coming out of the University of Illinois in Chicago. There's a lot of research about trees and crime in the University of Washington in Seattle as well. But really it's about connecting the dots. And Peter brought it up with the dogs. And I think there's something similar story to tell. When you have a street that's lined with trees, they're maintained, it's beautiful, it's shady, you're gonna have people walking there. You're gonna have people walking dogs. You're gonna have eyes on the street. You're gonna have neighbors who actually now know their neighbor and know what they look like and have a little more awareness about their surroundings. So it's a connecting the dots. Saying trees fight crime. I mean, a lot of people say trees lead to crime. I hear all the time, oh, a killer is gonna hide behind that tree and jump out and get me. Well, sure, they could hide behind that car too and jump out and get you. So, I don't know, but being able to do research like that would be fantastic if we had the partner for it. But there is stuff out there already being done. Like I said, out of University of Illinois and University of Washington. Our website has a lot of that information.
I was just curious about any efforts that you guys are undertaking focused on retaining existing canopy during things like construction and development, where it seems you see so many situations where an entire track is just completely cleared, and then they come back in and plant for red repairs or something, so you have this big net loss. I was just wondering how you address that.
I haven't chained myself to any trees yet, but I've definitely called my council members and my mayor a couple times. Yeah, that's a big part. In an ideal world, you would have an urban forester and a city forester. And the urban forester would be the person working on development projects and making sure that those protection codes are being adhered to, checking on contractors, but we don't have that. So my poor forester, we call her on a daily basis. Hey, this construction job down here, all their fencing is, there's a bulldozer parked on this tree. You can only do so much, but that is definitely a focus. And again, working at the neighborhood scale, one of the low-income neighborhoods with low tree canopy that we're working in this year, they just received a multi-million-dollar HUD grant to do housing. So we're working with the housing developers right from the get-go to help choose species and get this revolutionary idea. Actually use residents to plant the trees and manage the landscape versus contracted, outsourced landscape managers, which is the norm, and then you have no connection between the residents and the landscape. Somebody else is gonna do it. Somebody else is gonna pick up the litter or water that tree. We're actually trying to engage local youth in planting the trees. And we know, we have learned, it is a hardened fact, a tree planted by a volunteer does better than a tree planted by a contractor. Every single time. Every single time. Because that volunteer cares, they're taking their time. They just received a demonstration from us who plant trees absolutely perfectly, as opposed to a lot of the companies that are just get them in the ground and they're done. And no offense, because there's amazing contractors out there too, but overall, that's what we see. So,
And bridging presentations from this morning, we got to see a lot of spotlight trees in communities all across the world. With your Tree Stories campaign, did you have any spotlight trees that you could really hang your awareness marketing campaigns on?
it was always grandma's tree. I couldn't get over it. And even my tree story was about the big tree in my grand's yard. That, for some reason, that was the number one. There was that familial connection between the person and their loved one, the house where their loved one was. It was really amazing. No public trees really popped out during that process, interestingly enough. There were a couple where there's the tree that I showed you in the intro slide. That's a tree in a park that people get married under. So we definitely have those examples, but yeah, no.
Any other questions for Danielle?
You all ask the best questions. That tells me that you're already on the right track because you know what questions to ask.
Okay, please help me thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, everybody.